Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Philosopher, a quiet corner of the cosmos where restless minds find stillness. Here, curiosity wanders freely, guided by the wisdom of the Stoics, and gentle reflections help you drift into calm and peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're going to explore something that might just change the way you think about letting things go, about finding peace in a world that seems determined to disturb it. We're diving into the sleepy origins of Stoicism, a philosophy born not in lecture halls or ivory towers, but in the bustling marketplaces and quiet gardens of ancient Greece and Rome, where ordinary people discovered extraordinary ways to navigate life's storms. Before we drift too far into the past, I'd love it if you could give this video a gentle like and perhaps subscribe if you find these late-night philosophical wanderings as soothing as I do. It helps more curious minds find their way here, and honestly, it means the world to me. I'm also endlessly curious about where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're tucked under a blanket in a cozy apartment in Copenhagen, or perhaps you're watching from a quiet room in Tokyo as the city hums softly outside your window. Drop a comment below and let me know your location and what time it is where you are. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet connected by these ancient ideas that still whisper their wisdom to us today. Tonight's journey is called The Sleepy Origins of Stoicism, and we'll be floating gently through the remarkable story of how a philosophy designed to help people let go first took root in the ancient world. Because the truth is, Stoicism wasn't born in some grand philosophical moment. It emerged slowly, quietly, like dawn breaking over a still lake, from the very human need to find peace amid chaos, to discover what we can and cannot control, and to learn the gentle art of letting go. Please remember, everything in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing here is intended as medical, psychological, or life advice. Always consult with qualified professionals for guidance on matters affecting your well-being. Now, close your eyes if you like. Take a slow breath, and let's begin this journey back through time to a world where the seeds of one of humanity's most practical philosophies first began. Picture the streets of Athens around 300 BCE. The golden age of classical Greece is fading like the last light of evening. The great philosopher Aristotle has been dead for over 20 years. Plato's academy still echoes with debates. But the city-states that once seemed so mighty now find themselves under the shadow of rising powers. It's a time of uncertainty, of shifting allegiances, of people wondering what they can truly depend on when the world seems to change with each passing season. Into this landscape of gentle uncertainty walks a man named Zeno of Citium. Now, Zeno wasn't born in Athens. He came from Cyprus, a merchant's son, who understood the rhythms of trade, the rise and fall of fortunes, the way prosperity could slip through your fingers like sand. Legend tells us that Zeno arrived in Athens after a shipwreck had cost him his merchant cargo, his livelihood floating away on the Mediterranean waves. Standing in a foreign city with little more than the clothes on his back, he wandered into a bookshop and heard someone reading aloud from the works of Socrates. Something in those words stirred him deeply. Here was a man who had faced death with calm dignity, who had spoken of wisdom and virtue as the only true possessions that could never be taken away. Zeno asked the bookseller where he might find such a philosopher in Athens and was directed to Crates the Cynic, one of the more colourful characters in the philosophical landscape of the time. The Cynics, you see, believed in living simply, in stripping away all the unnecessary complications that society heaps upon us. They were the ancient world's minimalists, walking around with just a cloak and a staff, sleeping under the stars, and teaching that happiness comes not from having more, but from needing less. Crates became Zeno's teacher, and for years, the former merchant learned to let go of his attachments to material things, to social status, to all the external markers of success that had once defined his identity. But Zeno's mind was restless, always questioning, always refining. While he deeply appreciated the Cynic emphasis on virtue and simplicity, he began to feel that their approach was perhaps too harsh, too removed from the practical realities of daily life. Most people, after all, weren't going to abandon society entirely and live on the streets. Most people had families to care for, responsibilities to meet, roles to play in their communities. There had to be a way to find inner peace and wisdom while still engaging meaningfully with the world. So around 300 BCE, Zeno began teaching his own philosophy. He didn't have a school building or a famous academy. Instead, he gathered students in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a long covered walkway in the Athenian marketplace where people came to buy and sell, to meet friends, to conduct the business of daily life. It was here, surrounded by the gentle bustle of ordinary existence, that Stoicism was born. The word itself comes from this simple architectural feature. This stoa, this porch where regular people went about their regular lives. And perhaps there's something deeply fitting about that. Stoicism wasn't meant to be an abstract academic exercise. It was philosophy for the marketplace, wisdom for the merchant and the mother, the soldier and the senator, anyone who needed practical tools for navigating the beautiful complexity of human existence. Zeno's early teachings were revolutionary in their simplicity. He proposed that we could divide all of life into three categories: things that are up to us, things that are not up to us, and our judgments about both. The things that are up to us, he taught, are surprisingly few. Our thoughts, our choices, our responses, our values, our character. Everything else, literally everything else, falls into the second category. The weather, other people's actions, the past, the future, our reputation, our health, even our own lives, these are ultimately not under our complete control. This might sound pessimistic at first, like Zeno was telling people they were powerless, but actually, his insight was profoundly liberating. If you're only responsible for what's truly up to you, then you can stop exhausting yourself trying to control things that were never under your control in the first place. You can stop lying awake at night worrying about tomorrow's weather, or yesterday's mistakes, or whether someone likes you, or how the stock market might behave next week. Instead, you can focus all your energy, all your attention, all your care on the one thing that is genuinely, completely, absolutely yours to shape: your own character, your own responses, your own inner landscape. This is where your true power lies, Zeno taught, and it's a power that no storm can take from you, no tyrant can confiscate, no misfortune can diminish. The students who gathered around Zeno in that painted porch were learning what we might call the first principle of letting go. Not the kind of letting go that means giving up or becoming passive, but the kind that means releasing your grip on things that were never truly in your grasp anyway. It's like unclenching a fist that's been holding on to water, only to discover that when you open your hand, you're free to cup it and actually drink. As word of Zeno's teachings spread, the painted porch began attracting a remarkable variety of people. Some merchants had lost their fortunes and needed to rebuild not just their businesses, but their sense of self-worth. Soldiers were returning from campaigns, carrying invisible wounds and seeking a way to make sense of what they had witnessed. Parents were grieving lost children, young people anxious about their futures, older people reflecting on their past choices. What they all found in Zeno's gentle wisdom was not a promise that life would become easy, but something perhaps more valuable: a way to find peace within difficulty, strength within uncertainty, and a quiet kind of joy that doesn't depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. One of the most beautiful aspects of early Stoicism was how practical it was. Zeno didn't ask his students to retreat from the world, or to suppress their emotions, or to pretend that loss and disappointment don't hurt. Instead, he taught them to observe their own reactions with a kind of loving curiosity. to ask themselves gentle questions about what they were trying to control and whether that control was actually possible. If you were worried about an upcoming business deal, a Stoic might ask, what part of this situation is actually up to you? You can prepare thoroughly, you can act with integrity, you can respond gracefully to whatever outcome emerges. But you cannot control the other person's decision, the market conditions, or the 1,000 unpredictable factors that might influence the result. So why not put your energy into the preparation and the integrity and let the rest unfold as it will? This wasn't resignation or fatalism. It was a kind of strategic wisdom, a way of investing your limited emotional and mental resources where they could actually make a difference. And the remarkable thing was how much lighter people felt when they truly understood this distinction. It was as if they had been carrying a heavy backpack filled with responsibilities that were never theirs to bear, and suddenly they were allowed to set it down. The early Stoics developed exercises, gentle practices that helped people internalize these insights. They might spend time each morning reflecting on what the day might bring, mentally preparing for both pleasant and unpleasant possibilities. Not to become pessimistic, but to become more flexible, more resilient, less likely to be thrown off balance by unexpected events. They practice something called the view from above, imagining themselves from a great height or distance, seeing their current worries and preoccupations in the larger context of time and space. From this perspective, many of the things that seemed so urgent and important revealed themselves to be more manageable, less catastrophic than they had appeared up close. They cultivated what they called prosos, a kind of continuous attention to the present moment and to their own inner state. Not in a self-absorbed way, but with the gentle awareness of a gardener tending plants, noticing what thoughts and emotions were growing in the soil of their consciousness, nurturing the helpful ones and allowing the unhelpful ones to wither through lack of attention. As Zeno aged and his teachings matured, the painted porch became something like a laboratory for human flourishing. Students would bring their real-life challenges and work through them together, testing the principles against actual experience, refining their understanding through practice and conversation. The beauty of this early Stoicism was how undogmatic it was. Zeno encouraged questions, welcomed doubt, invited students to examine the teachings for themselves rather than simply accepting them on authority. He understood that wisdom cannot be handed down like a family heirloom. It has to be discovered, practiced, lived into, made one's own through the gentle alchemy of experience and reflection. And this approach attracted followers from all walks of life, each bringing their own struggles and discoveries to the conversations that unfolded beneath the painted columns. There was something deeply democratic about this philosophy, something that spoke to the universal human experience of trying to find solid ground in a world that often feels like shifting sand. Among those early students was Cleanthes, a man whose story illustrates perfectly how Stoicism was meant to be lived rather than merely studied. Cleanthes worked as a night shift boxer and day laborer to pay for his philosophical education. He would spend his nights training his body, his days working with his hands, and his evenings listening to Zeno's teachings about the relationship between physical effort and inner strength. When critics accused him of being too poor to be a true philosopher, Cleanthes would simply roll up his sleeves and show them his calloused hands. "This is my proof," he would say quietly. "I work for what I believe in." There was no shame in labor, no contradiction between earning one's bread and seeking wisdom. In fact, the physical discipline required to maintain his livelihood became part of his philosophical practice, a daily reminder that true strength comes from within. Cleanthes eventually succeeded Zeno as head of the school, and under his guidance, Stoicism began to develop its distinctive approach to emotions. The early Stoics noticed something fascinating about human suffering. It often came not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. A rainstorm is just water falling from the sky, until we decide it's ruining our picnic. A delayed train is just a mechanical pause until we choose to see it as a personal inconvenience. This insight led to what might be called the gentle art of reframing. Instead of trying to eliminate difficult emotions, which rarely works and often makes things worse, the Stoics learned to examine the thoughts and beliefs that generated those emotions. They developed a kind of loving curiosity about their own mental processes, asking themselves questions like, what story am I telling myself about this situation? What assumptions am I making? What would happen if I tried a different interpretation? This wasn't positive thinking or denial. It was a sophisticated form of cognitive flexibility, a recognition that our minds are constantly interpreting reality and that we might have more choice in those interpretations than we typically realize. A Stoic merchant who lost a shipment might initially feel devastated, but then pause and ask, what can this teach me? How might this redirect my path in ways I cannot yet see? What opportunities might emerge from this apparent setback? The painted porch became known for these kinds of conversations, gentle explorations of how the same event could be experienced completely differently, depending on the lens through which it was viewed. Students would share stories of transformation, moments when shifting their perspective had changed not just their emotional response, but their entire relationship to challenge and change. As the philosophy matured, it began to attract attention from beyond Athens. Traders carried these ideas along the Mediterranean trade routes, sharing them in the ports and marketplaces of the ancient world. Soldiers brought Stoic principles to their campaigns, finding in them resources for courage and resilience that went deeper than mere bravado. One of the most beautiful developments was the emergence of what the Stoics called sympatheia, the interconnectedness of all things. They began to see that letting go of our need to control everything didn't make us isolated or indifferent. Instead, it allowed us to participate more fully in the larger patterns of existence, to find our place in what they called the cosmic city, the universal community of rational beings. This vision was both humbling and elevating. You were just one small part of a vast, intricate system, no more or less important than anyone else. But you were also an essential part, with your own unique role to play, your own contributions to make to the great unfolding story of existence. The key was learning to play that role with excellence, while remaining unattached to the applause or criticism of the audience. The third great teacher of the early Stoa was Chrysippus, a man whose prolific writings helped systematize and preserve these teachings for future generations. Chrysippus was known for his logical precision, his ability to take the intuitive insights of Zeno and Cleanthes and articulate them with philosophical rigor. Under his influence, Stoicism developed its characteristic emphasis on reason as the tool for achieving emotional balance. But this wasn't cold, calculating reason. It was reason infused with compassion, logic applied in service of wisdom and virtue. Chrysippus taught that our emotions are not irrational forces that overcome us, but rather the natural result of our judgments and beliefs. Change the judgment, he suggested, and the emotion changes with it. This gave people tremendous hope. It meant that no one was permanently stuck with destructive emotional patterns. With patience and practice, with gentle attention to the stories we tell ourselves, anyone could learn to respond to life's challenges with greater equanimity and grace. The exercises developed during this period reflect this optimistic yet realistic approach to human nature. There was the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what we want must happen. There was the discipline of action, learning to act with virtue regardless of outcomes. And there was the discipline of assent, learning to examine our judgments before accepting them as truth. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts, but practical tools for daily living. A parent dealing with a rebellious teenager might practice the discipline of desire, accepting that their child must find their own path while still providing love and guidance. A business owner facing financial difficulties might practice the discipline of action, focusing on ethical decision-making rather than desperate attempts to control market forces. The painted porch during these early decades must have been an extraordinary place, filled with the quiet energy of people discovering their own strength and resilience. Conversations would flow from the theoretical to the practical and back again, as students tested these ideas against the real challenges of their lives. There were merchants learning to hold their business ventures lightly, investing their best efforts while accepting that success and failure were part of a larger pattern beyond their control. There were parents discovering that their children were not extensions of themselves, but independent beings deserving of respect and freedom. There were soldiers finding ways to serve with courage while maintaining their humanity even in the midst of conflict. What emerged from these years of patient development was not just a philosophy, but a way of life, a set of practices and perspectives that could transform how someone experienced everything from minor daily frustrations to major life transitions. The early Stoics had created something remarkable, a practical wisdom tradition that was both deeply personal and universally applicable. The genius of this approach was its recognition that lasting peace comes not from arranging external circumstances to our liking, which is ultimately impossible, but from developing the inner resources to meet whatever circumstances arise with dignity and grace. This wasn't a recipe for passivity or indifference, but for a different kind of engagement with life, one based on wisdom rather than wishful thinking, on acceptance rather than denial. As the sun set over Athens each evening, casting long shadows across the painted porch, students would carry these insights home with them, testing them against the realities of family life, work, relationships, and all the beautiful complexity of human existence. They were learning day by day, conversation by conversation, challenge by challenge, what it truly meant to let go without giving up, to care deeply while holding lightly, to find freedom within whatever circumstances life might offer. The seeds planted in that simple covered walkway would eventually grow into one of the most enduring and practical wisdom traditions the world has ever known. But in those early years, it was simply a group of sincere people gathering regularly to explore the most fundamental questions of human existence. How can we be happy? How can we be good? How can we find peace in an uncertain world? The answers they discovered in those quiet evening discussions would echo through centuries, but perhaps what made those early conversations so powerful was their gentleness. There was no forcing, no harsh discipline, no demand for immediate transformation. Instead, there was an invitation to observe, to question, to experiment with new ways of thinking and being. One of the students who exemplified this gentle approach was a woman named Hipparchia, though she's often overlooked in the traditional accounts. She had initially been drawn to the more radical Cynic philosophy, but found in the early Stoic teachings a middle path that honored both wisdom and practical engagement with life. Her presence in those discussions brought questions about how these principles might apply differently to women's experiences, to the particular challenges of navigating a world where social expectations could be especially confining. Hipparchia's contributions helped shape what would become one of Stoicism's most revolutionary insights, that true freedom isn't about external circumstances, but about the quality of our inner life. A person could be physically constrained yet mentally free, just as someone with every external advantage might be trapped by their own fears and desires. This understanding would prove especially powerful for those who faced systemic limitations, offering a form of dignity and agency that no external authority could remove. The beauty of these early teachings was how they acknowledged the full spectrum of human experience without demanding that people pretend to feel differently than they did. If you were grieving, you were encouraged to grieve fully while also examining the beliefs that might be intensifying your pain. If you were angry, you were invited to feel that anger completely while also exploring what judgments might be fueling the fire. This created a kind of emotional honesty that was rare in philosophical circles. Students would arrive at the painted porch carrying real sorrows, genuine fears, authentic struggles. They weren't expected to leave those human experiences at the door, but rather to bring them into the light of gentle inquiry. What beliefs are creating this suffering? What stories am I telling myself? What might I be trying to control that isn't actually controllable? The conversations that emerged from this approach were remarkably practical. A farmer worried about his crops might discover that while he couldn't control the weather, he could control his preparation, his response to whatever harvest emerged, and his ability to find meaning even in difficult seasons. A mother anxious about her child's future might realize that while she couldn't guarantee her daughter's happiness, she could offer love, wisdom, and the modeling of how to meet life's uncertainties with grace. These weren't abstract philosophical discussions, but deeply personal explorations of how to live well in an unpredictable world. The early Stoics understood something that modern psychology would later rediscover, that our suffering often comes not from events themselves, but from the gap between what we expect and what actually unfolds. Close that gap by aligning expectations with reality, and much of our emotional turbulence simply dissolves. But this alignment wasn't achieved through cynicism or lowered expectations. Instead, it came through a kind of radical acceptance of life's fundamental nature. The Stoics observed that change is the only constant, that loss is woven into the very fabric of existence, that uncertainty is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be navigated with wisdom and skill. This perspective led to some of their most beautiful practices. They would spend time each morning contemplating the temporary nature of everything they held dear, not to become sad or detached, but to appreciate these gifts more fully while they were present. They called this exercise loving what is mortal, and it transformed how they experienced everything from a sunset to a conversation with a friend. When you truly understand that this moment will never come again, that this person will not always be in your life, that this season of joy or sorrow is temporary, something shifts in the quality of your attention. You become more present, more grateful, more willing to let each experience be exactly what it is, rather than demanding that it be something else. The painted porch became a laboratory for this kind of presence. Students would practice paying attention to their breath, to the sensations in their bodies, to the thoughts moving through their minds, not to achieve some special state, but simply to notice what was actually happening in the present moment. This awareness became the foundation for all their other practices. From this grounded awareness, they could observe their desires and aversions more clearly. They began to notice how much energy they spent wanting things to be different than they were, how much suffering came from resistance to what was actually unfolding. This observation led naturally to the practice of acceptance, not as resignation, but as a form of intelligent cooperation with reality. One student, a potter named Demetrius, discovered this principle through his craft. When a pot cracked in the kiln, he could spend energy being frustrated about the crack, or he could examine why it happened and apply that learning to future work. The crack wasn't personal. It wasn't a judgment on his worth as a potter. It was simply information about clay and fire and timing. This same perspective, he found, could be applied to everything in life: relationships, health challenges, business setbacks, social changes. They were all just clay and fire and timing. Some outcomes were more pleasant than others, certainly, but none of them were personal attacks from the universe. They were simply the natural result of countless factors interacting in ways too complex for any individual mind to fully understand or control. This realization was profoundly liberating. Students began to report feeling lighter, more resilient, less likely to be thrown off balance by unexpected events. They were learning what Zeno had promised from the beginning, that peace comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from developing the inner resources to meet whatever circumstances arise with dignity and wisdom. The exercises that emerged from these insights were elegantly simple. Each morning, students might spend a few minutes reflecting on the day ahead, imagining both pleasant and challenging possibilities, mentally preparing to respond to each with virtue rather than mere reaction. This wasn't pessimistic planning, but realistic preparation, like a sailor checking the weather before setting out to sea. In the evening, they would review the day that had passed, noticing moments when they had responded wisely and moments when they had been caught up in old patterns of reaction. This reflection wasn't harsh self-judgment, but gentle learning, the kind of honest assessment that allows growth and refinement. They developed practices for dealing with difficult people, recognizing that others' behavior reflected their own inner state, rather than any deliberate attempt to cause harm. This understanding cultivated compassion, even for those who seemed unreasonable or hostile. As one student put it, hurt people, but understanding people can respond with kindness regardless of how they're treated. The economic principles that emerged from early Stoicism were equally practical. Students learned to distinguish between wants and needs, recognizing that much of their financial anxiety came from confusing the two. They practiced gratitude for what they already possessed, which naturally reduced the compulsive desire for more. They developed what we might now call sustainable approaches to wealth, viewing money as a tool for virtue rather than an end in itself. These weren't rules imposed from outside, but insights that emerged naturally from understanding the relationship between external things and internal peace. A merchant who truly grasped these principles might work just as hard to build his business, but he would hold the results more lightly, knowing that his sense of worth and happiness didn't depend on any particular level of financial success. The approach to health and aging that developed during this period was similarly wise and practical. The early Stoics recognized that while they could influence their physical well-being through good habits and wise choices, they couldn't control the ultimate trajectory of their bodies. This led to a kind of grateful stewardship of their physical selves, caring for their health while accepting the natural processes of change and eventual decline. Students would practice exercises in mortality, not to become morbid, but to develop a healthy relationship with the temporary nature of embodied existence. They might spend time in cemeteries, reflecting on the lives of those who had gone before, or contemplate their own eventual death as a natural transition rather than a failure or tragedy. These practices created a remarkable quality of presence in daily life. When you truly understand that your time here is limited and precious, you naturally become more selective about how you spend your attention and energy. Petty grievances seem less important. Moments of beauty become more vivid. Relationships deepen because you're not taking them for granted. The political philosophy that emerged from the painted porch was equally nuanced. The early Stoics understood that while they couldn't control the actions of rulers or the outcomes of elections, they could control their own civic participation and moral choices. This led to a form of engaged detachment, caring deeply about justice and the common good while remaining unattached to specific political outcomes. Some students became more active in public life, viewing their participation as an expression of virtue rather than a path to power or recognition. Others focused their service on family and local community, recognizing that there are many ways to contribute to human flourishing. What united them was the understanding that ethical action is its own reward, regardless of whether it produces the results we hope for. The conversations about friendship and love that unfolded during these years were particularly beautiful. The Stoics recognized that while we cannot control whether others love us or remain in our lives, we can control the quality of love we offer. This led to a form of relationship that was both deeply caring and fundamentally free, loving others for who they are rather than for what they provide us. Students learned to distinguish between attachment and love, recognizing that true affection wants the best for the other person, even when that might mean letting them go. This understanding transformed marriages, friendships, and family relationships, creating space for people to grow and change without feeling constrained by others' expectations or needs. Parents, in particular, found these insights revolutionary. They learned to see their children not as extensions of themselves, but as independent beings with their own paths to walk. This didn't make them less caring or protective, but it did make them less anxious and controlling. They could offer guidance and support while respecting their children's autonomy and learning process. As word of these teachings spread beyond Athens, they began to evolve and adapt to different cultural contexts. The core insights remained consistent, but their expression varied depending on the particular challenges and opportunities of different societies. What had begun as conversations in a painted porch was becoming a living tradition, flexible enough to address the universal aspects of human experience while remaining relevant to specific circumstances. The early students who carried these ideas to other cities and countries often found themselves serving as informal counselors and guides, helping people apply stoic principles to their particular struggles. A Roman soldier might learn to find courage without brutality. An Egyptian merchant might discover how to conduct business with integrity, even in corrupt systems. A Celtic farmer might find ways to work with natural cycles rather than fighting against them. What made this transmission possible was the fundamentally practical nature of Stoic wisdom. These weren't abstract theories that required years of study to understand, but simple principles that could be tested immediately against real-life experience. Anyone could try the basic exercise of distinguishing between what is and isn't under their control. Anyone could experiment with accepting what cannot be changed, while working skillfully with what can be influenced. The letters and writings that began to emerge from this period reveal the quiet transformation that was occurring in ordinary people's lives. There are accounts of individuals who had been paralyzed by anxiety, finding new confidence and peace. Stories of people who had been consumed by anger, discovering compassion and understanding. Reports of those who had felt powerless, realizing their own quiet strength and dignity. These transformations weren't dramatic conversions, but gentle shifts in perspective, like adjusting the focus on a telescope until distant objects become clear. The same life circumstances might remain, but the person experiencing them would be fundamentally different, more resilient, more compassionate, more capable of finding meaning and purpose even in difficult conditions. The painted porch continued to be the heart of this growing movement, but it was no longer the only place where these conversations were happening. Students would gather in homes and gardens, in workshops and marketplaces, wherever people were willing to explore these questions together. The philosophy was becoming democratized, accessible to anyone, regardless of their education or social status. This accessibility was intentional. Zeno and his successors understood that wisdom belongs to humanity as a whole, not to any particular class or group. The challenges they were addressing, how to find peace in uncertainty, how to respond wisely to loss and change, how to maintain dignity in the face of adversity, these were universal human experiences that transcended cultural and social boundaries. As the years passed and the original students of Zeno grew older, they began to see the fruits of their long practice. Many reported a quality of inner stability they had never experienced before, a sense of being rooted in something deeper than circumstances. They had learned not just intellectually, but in their bones, that their well-being didn't depend on external things going according to plan. This wasn't indifference or detachment from life, but rather a deeper form of engagement, one based on wisdom rather than wishful thinking. They could care deeply about their work, their relationships, their communities, while holding all of it lightly enough that loss or change didn't destroy their fundamental sense of peace and purpose. The elderly Zeno, reflecting on decades of teaching and practice, would often speak of the painted porch as a laboratory of human potential. What they had discovered there wasn't new, he would say, but rather a rediscovery of capacities that had always been present in human consciousness, waiting to be cultivated and expressed. The seeds that had been planted in that simple covered walkway were beginning to sprout in ways that none of the original participants could have imagined. But that growth, that spreading influence, that transformation of individual lives and entire cultures. That is a story for the centuries that followed, when Stoicism would travel from the marketplaces of Athens to the palaces of Rome, and eventually to every corner of the world, where human beings continue to ask the eternal questions. How can we be happy? How can we be good? How can we find peace in an uncertain world? The quiet revolution that began in the painted porch was just beginning. The sleepy origins of Stoicism had awakened something in human consciousness that would never again be fully dormant. And in the gentle art of letting go that those early students discovered, we can still find today the keys to a kind of freedom that no external circumstance can touch. The influence of these early teachings began to ripple outward from Athens like stones dropped into still water, each circle expanding beyond what the original teachers could have imagined. As merchants and travelers carried these ideas along the ancient trade routes, something remarkable began to happen. The philosophy that had been born in the practical conversations of the painted porch started to adapt and evolve, taking root in the fertile soil of different cultures and circumstances. In the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean, ship captains found themselves applying Stoic principles to the unpredictable nature of sea travel. They learned to prepare their vessels with meticulous care, while accepting that storms, pirates, and contrary winds were simply part of the reality they navigated. This wasn't fatalism, but practical wisdom. The recognition that their skill and diligence mattered precisely because they couldn't control the outcome. One such captain, a man named Marcus, whose weathered hands told stories of countless voyages, would later write to a friend back in Athens about how these teachings had transformed his relationship with the sea. Where once he had cursed every delayed departure and unexpected gale, he now found himself appreciating the intricate dance between human effort and natural forces. His crew noticed the change, reporting that their captain's newfound equanimity made him both a more decisive leader and a more pleasant companion during long months at sea. The transformation wasn't limited to those who worked with their hands. In the scholarly circles of Alexandria, where the great library housed the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, philosophers and mathematicians began incorporating Stoic insights into their approach to learning itself. They discovered that the same principles that helped merchants accept financial losses could help scholars accept the collapse of cherished theories when new evidence emerged. A young mathematician named Apollodorus, working on problems of geometry that had puzzled thinkers for generations, found that his attachment to particular solutions was actually hindering his progress. When he learned to hold his hypotheses lightly, to remain curious rather than defensive when his calculations didn't work out, he began making breakthroughs that had eluded more rigid minds. The willingness to let go of what wasn't working opened space for what might actually be true. This principle of intellectual humility became one of the most practical applications of early Stoic thought. Students in various fields began to understand that their emotional investment in being right was often the very thing that prevented them from discovering truth. A physician in Pergamon wrote about how this insight had revolutionized his practice. Instead of defending his initial diagnoses when patients didn't improve, he learned to observe more carefully, to question his assumptions, to let the evidence guide his understanding rather than forcing the evidence to fit his preconceptions. The ripple effects extended into the most intimate spheres of daily life. Families throughout the Greek world began experimenting with these ideas, finding that the principles that worked in marketplaces and ship cabins could transform the dynamics of home life as well. Parents discovered that their children responded differently when discipline came from a place of wisdom rather than reactive emotion. Spouses found that their relationships deepened when they stopped trying to change each other and focused instead on their own responses and choices. A pottery workshop in Corinth became an unlikely laboratory for these domestic applications. The master potter, an elderly woman named Thalia, had learned Stoic principles from a student who had studied directly under Zeno. She began teaching her apprentices not just the technical aspects of their craft, but also how to work with clay as a metaphor for working with life itself. Clay has its own nature, she would tell them, its own possibilities and limitations. Your job is not to force it into shapes it cannot hold, but to discover what it wants to become and help it get there. This approach transformed the workshop's atmosphere. Instead of the frustrated cursing that typically accompanied broken pots and failed glazes, there was a spirit of curious experimentation. Apprentices learned to see mistakes not as personal failures, but as information about the interaction between their intentions and the material world. This shift in perspective not only made them better potters, but also better prepared for the countless small disappointments and surprises that fill ordinary days. The principles were finding expression in unexpected places. In the gymnasia, where young men trained their bodies for athletic competition, coaches began incorporating Stoic ideas about the relationship between effort and outcome. Athletes learned to pour their complete dedication into training, while accepting that victory depended on factors beyond their control: their opponent's preparation, the weather on competition day, the judges' decisions, even their own physical condition on any given morning. This created a different kind of competitor, one who could perform with maximum intensity while remaining emotionally balanced regardless of results. A young wrestler from Thebes would later describe how this approach had freed him from the paralyzing anxiety that had previously undermined his performance. When he stopped needing to win and focused instead on wrestling with excellence, he paradoxically began winning more often. But more importantly, he found joy in the sport itself, rather than only in its outcomes. The influence spread to the arts as well. Musicians and poets began exploring how Stoic principles might inform creative expression. They discovered that the same acceptance of uncertainty that helped merchants and sailors could liberate artistic creativity. A lyre player in Delphi wrote about how her music had become more expressive once she stopped being attached to particular responses from her audience. When she played for the music itself rather than for applause or approval, her performances became more authentic and, ironically, more moving to those who heard them. Painters and sculptors found similar liberation in letting go of their attachment to specific artistic outcomes. They could invest completely in their work, while remaining open to how the materials and the creative process itself might guide the final result. This produced art that felt more alive, more spontaneous, more connected to the natural world that Stoics saw as their larger home. The economic implications of these teachings were becoming clear as well. Merchants who had learned to distinguish between profit and greed found that their businesses became more sustainable and their relationships with customers more honest. They could pursue success vigorously while maintaining their integrity and accepting whatever level of prosperity emerged from their ethical efforts. A grain merchant in Rhodes became famous throughout the island, not for his wealth, though he was comfortably prosperous, but for his fairness during times of scarcity. When poor harvests created shortages, he refused to exploit the situation for maximum profit, instead finding ways to ensure that everyone in the community had access to basic necessities. His Stoic training had taught him that his character mattered more than his bank account, and this principle guided his business decisions, even when it cost him money. This approach to commerce began influencing entire trading networks. Merchants who had adopted Stoic principles found that they preferred doing business with others who shared similar values. Trust became more important than the lowest price, long-term relationships more valuable than short-term gains. This created what we might now call ethical business ecosystems, networks of traders who supported each other, not just economically, but morally and philosophically as well. The teachings were also beginning to influence how communities dealt with collective challenges. When natural disasters struck, cities that had been exposed to Stoic ideas responded with a kind of organized resilience that impressed observers from other regions. Instead of being paralyzed by the scale of destruction or consumed by blame and recrimination, These communities focused their energy on what could be done to help those in need and rebuild what had been lost. After a devastating earthquake struck a small city in Asia Minor, visitors from Athens were amazed at the calm efficiency with which the residents organized relief efforts. There was grief, certainly, and acknowledgement of the real losses that had occurred. But there was no wasted energy on raging against fate or searching for someone to blame for what was clearly a natural phenomenon beyond human control. Instead, there was a quiet determination to respond to the disaster with whatever wisdom, skill, and compassion they could muster. This practical resilience began attracting attention from political leaders as well. Governors and city officials started inviting teachers trained in Stoic principles to advise them on matters of public policy. They were discovering that the same insights that helped individuals navigate personal challenges could inform approaches to governance and social organization. The question of how to balance personal responsibility with social support, for instance, found new clarity through Stoic analysis. Communities learned to provide assistance to those in genuine need while encouraging individual initiative and self-reliance. They developed systems that helped people through temporary difficulties without creating permanent dependence. Recognizing that true compassion sometimes meant allowing people to face challenges that would strengthen their character and capabilities. A young administrator in Ephesus, influenced by these ideas, developed innovative approaches to public works projects. Instead of simply hiring laborers to build roads and aqueducts, he created programs that taught valuable skills while accomplishing necessary infrastructure improvements. Workers learned masonry, engineering, and project management while contributing to their community's development. This approach honored both the practical needs of the city and the dignity of its citizens. The influence on education was perhaps most profound of all. Schools throughout the Greek world began incorporating Stoic principles into their curricula, not as abstract philosophy, but as practical life skills. Students learned arithmetic and rhetoric alongside lessons in emotional regulation and ethical decision-making. They practiced distinguishing between what they could and couldn't control in their academic work, their relationships with peers, their responses to criticism and praise. A school in Miletus became famous for producing graduates who were not only well-educated in traditional subjects, but also remarkably mature and resilient. These young people could handle setbacks without being crushed, accept success without becoming arrogant, and navigate social conflicts with unusual wisdom and grace. Other cities began sending delegations to study this educational approach and adapt it to their own institutions. The changes in family life were equally significant. Parents who had learned Stoic principles began raising children with a different balance of love and discipline, support and independence. They provided guidance while respecting their children's autonomy, offered protection while allowing age-appropriate challenges that would build character and capability. A father in Pergamon wrote to his brother about how these ideas had changed his relationship with his teenage son. Instead of the constant battles over behavior and choices that had characterized their earlier interactions, they now had conversations about values and decision-making. The boy was learning to think for himself while still benefiting from his father's experience and wisdom. Their relationship had become more honest, more respectful, and paradoxically, more affectionate, as the father had learned to love his son as he was, rather than trying to mold him into a predetermined shape. Women, despite the social limitations of their time, were also finding ways to apply these teachings to their particular circumstances. In households throughout the ancient world, mothers and daughters were discovering that Stoic principles could provide dignity and agency even within constrained roles. They learned to find fulfillment in their duties while maintaining their sense of individual worth and purpose. A woman in Corinth, whose letters were preserved by her granddaughter, wrote eloquently about how these ideas had transformed her experience of domestic life. The same tasks that had once felt like drudgery, caring for children, managing household resources, maintaining relationships with extended family, became opportunities for practicing virtue and developing wisdom. She had learned to find meaning in service while maintaining her intellectual curiosity and personal growth. The approach to health and medicine was evolving as well. Physicians trained in Stoic principles developed a more holistic understanding of healing, recognizing the intimate connection between mental and physical well-being. They learned to treat not just symptoms but the whole person, helping patients develop the inner resources that could support healing and prevent future illness. A physician in Kos, working in the tradition of Hippocrates but influenced by Stoic insights, began incorporating what we might now call counseling into his medical practice. He helped patients examine the beliefs and attitudes that might be contributing to their physical ailments, teaching them techniques for managing stress and anxiety that often proved as effective as herbal remedies and surgical interventions. This integrated approach to healing began influencing medical education throughout the Greek world. Students learned anatomy and pharmacology alongside lessons in psychology and ethics. They developed bedside manners that combined technical competence with genuine compassion and wisdom. Patients reported feeling not just physically treated, but emotionally supported and spiritually nourished by their encounters with these caregivers. The influence on military culture was particularly striking. Soldiers and officers who had been exposed to Stoic teachings brought a different quality to their service. They could be fierce in battle while remaining humane in victory, disciplined in training while compassionate toward their comrades, loyal to their duties while maintaining their moral compass, even in morally ambiguous situations. A veteran commander, reflecting on decades of military service, wrote about how Stoic principles had helped him navigate the complex challenges of leadership in wartime. He had learned to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by their weight, to accept casualties without becoming callous to human suffering, to maintain hope during dark periods without losing touch with reality. His troops trusted him because they sensed that his courage came from wisdom rather than recklessness, his authority from character rather than mere rank. These military applications began influencing military training throughout the ancient world. Soldiers learned not just tactics and weapons handling, but also mental discipline and emotional resilience. They practiced exercises in courage and endurance that prepared them for the psychological as well as physical demands of warfare. This created more effective fighting forces, but perhaps more importantly, it produced veterans who could reintegrate into civilian life with greater ease and purpose. The artistic and literary expressions that emerged from this period reflect the quiet transformation that was occurring throughout Greek society. Poets began writing verses that explored themes of acceptance and wisdom. Musicians composed melodies that seemed to embody the serenity that came from understanding what could and couldn't be controlled. Architects designed buildings that reflected the Stoic appreciation for both human dignity and natural harmony. A playwright in Athens, inspired by these teachings, began writing dramas that explored moral dilemmas with unusual nuance and depth. His characters faced the same tragic circumstances that had always been the stuff of Greek theatre, but they responded with a kind of heroic acceptance that was both deeply human and profoundly inspiring. Audiences left his performances feeling not just entertained, but somehow strengthened, more prepared to face their own challenges with dignity and grace. The festivals and religious observances of this period also began reflecting Stoic influences. While maintaining their traditional forms and cultural significance, they increasingly emphasized themes of gratitude, acceptance, and the interconnectedness of all life. Participants found in these celebrations not just communal joy, but also deeper meaning, a sense of their place in the larger patterns of existence. A priestess at Delphi, writing about the evolution of religious practice during this time, noted that pilgrims seemed to be coming not just to seek predictions about the future, but to find peace with uncertainty itself. They were learning to consult the oracle, not to gain control over their destinies, but to develop the wisdom to respond skillfully to whatever destinies might unfold. This represented a profound shift in how people related to the divine and to the mystery of existence itself. As these various influences began to interconnect and reinforce each other, something like a cultural transformation was occurring. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather like the gradual change of seasons, subtle but unmistakable to those who paid attention. Communities were becoming more resilient, relationships more honest, individuals more capable of finding meaning and purpose even in difficult circumstances. Travelers moving through the Greek world during this period often commented on a quality they sensed but couldn't quite name. There was something in the air, they would write, a kind of quiet strength and wisdom that seemed to characterize the people they encountered. Conversations in markets and taverns had a different quality, less anxious complaining and more thoughtful reflection. Conflicts still arose, but they were handled with more maturity and less destructive emotion. This transformation was particularly visible in how communities responded to the natural challenges that were part of ancient life. Crop failures, disease outbreaks, political upheavals, these difficulties still occurred, but they were met with what we might call philosophical resilience. People had learned to distinguish between the pain that comes from circumstances and the suffering that comes from resistance to circumstances. They could grieve losses without being destroyed by them, face uncertainties without being paralyzed by anxiety. A merchant traveling from Egypt to the Black Sea wrote to his family about the remarkable consistency of this attitude across different cities and cultures. Wherever Stoic ideas had taken root, he found people who seemed more centered, more capable of enjoying good fortune without being attached to it, and enduring hardship without being crushed by it. It wasn't that life had become easier in these places, but rather that people had developed better tools for living whatever life they encountered. The economic implications of this cultural shift were becoming significant as well. Trade relationships became more stable when they were based on mutual respect and long-term thinking rather than short-term advantage. Contracts were more likely to be honored, disputes resolved more fairly, partnerships maintained through both prosperous and difficult periods. This created a kind of commercial trust that facilitated economic growth while maintaining ethical standards. Cities that had embraced these principles began attracting settlers and traders who valued the predictability and fairness they found there. This created positive feedback loops as communities that practiced Stoic virtues became more prosperous, which in turn allowed them to be more generous and supportive of those in need, which further enhanced their reputations and attractiveness to others. But perhaps the most significant development was how these ideas were beginning to influence the next generation. Children who had grown up in households and communities shaped by Stoic principles were reaching adulthood with capabilities and perspectives that amazed their elders. They seemed naturally equipped with emotional resilience, ethical clarity, and practical wisdom that typically took years to develop. These young people were less prone to the dramatic mood swings and impulsive decisions that often characterized youth. They could handle criticism without being devastated, accept praise without becoming arrogant, face challenges without being overwhelmed by anxiety. Most remarkably, they seemed to understand intuitively the difference between what they could and couldn't control, applying this knowledge to everything from academic studies to romantic relationships. A teacher in Rhodes wrote about a class of students who exemplified this new generation. When faced with a particularly difficult examination, instead of panicking or making excuses, they simply focused on preparing as thoroughly as possible, while accepting that the outcome would depend on factors beyond their preparation. They supported each other without competing destructively, asked questions without fear of appearing ignorant, and approached their studies with both seriousness and joy. This generational shift suggested that Stoicism was evolving from a philosophy that individuals had to learn and practice into something more like a cultural wisdom that could be absorbed naturally through growing up in communities that embodied these principles. The painted porch in Athens had become the seed of a transformation that was spreading organically through the ancient world, taking root wherever people were ready to embrace a different way of thinking about happiness, success, and the good life. As the sun set over the Mediterranean each evening, casting its ancient light across cities and countryside, it illuminated a world that was quietly but profoundly different from what it had been just a few generations earlier. The seeds planted in Zeno's conversations were growing into something their original planters could never have fully imagined. A living tradition that would continue to evolve and spread, carrying its message of practical wisdom to every corner of the human experience. The sleepy origins of Stoicism had awakened something enduring in human consciousness. And this awakening was just beginning. The gentle art of letting go that had first been explored in the painted porch was becoming a way of life for thousands of people, and through them, it would eventually touch millions more across the centuries to come. But that larger story, the tale of how these ideas would travel from Greece to Rome and beyond, transforming empires and individuals alike, that is a journey we have yet to fully explore. For now, it is enough to appreciate the quiet miracle of those early years, when a handful of sincere seekers gathered regularly to discuss the most fundamental questions of human existence and discovered answers that would echo through the ages. Their conversations had planted seeds that were already growing beyond anything they could have imagined, spreading through the ancient world like dawn, breaking slowly across a vast landscape, bringing light to places that had long been shadowed by confusion, anxiety, and unnecessary suffering. The revolution that began in the painted porch was indeed a gentle one, but like all true revolutions, it changed everything it touched. And as these ideas continued to spread and evolve, they carried within them the promise of transformation that had attracted that first shipwrecked merchant to a simple bookshop in Athens, the promise that wisdom and peace were not distant destinations, but present possibilities, available to anyone willing to look honestly at life and learn to work skillfully with what they found there. The transformation that was quietly unfolding across the Mediterranean world during these decades was perhaps most visible in the way people began to approach their most intimate relationships with death and mortality. Where once the subject had been shrouded in superstition and paralyzing fear, communities touched by Stoic wisdom developed a remarkably mature and peaceful relationship with life's final transition. A physician in Pergamon wrote extensively about this shift in his patients' attitudes. Where he had once spent much of his time trying to comfort people who were terrified by the prospect of their own mortality, he now found himself having entirely different conversations. Patients facing serious illnesses would ask not just about treatments and prognoses, but about how to live fully within whatever time remained to them. They seemed to understand instinctively that the quality of their remaining days mattered more than their quantity. This wasn't denial or false bravery, but rather a kind of realistic acceptance that allowed people to focus their energy on what truly mattered. An elderly weaver in Miletus, diagnosed with a condition that would likely claim her life within the year, spent her remaining months teaching her craft to young women in her community, passing on not just technical skills, but the patience and attention that had brought her decades of satisfaction in her work. She spoke openly about her approaching death, not with morbid fascination, but with the same practical planning she might apply to any other significant life transition. Families began developing rituals and practices around death that reflected this healthier perspective. Instead of the frantic denial that had often characterized responses to terminal illness, loved ones learned to have honest conversations about practical matters while also creating space for meaningful connection and closure. Children were included in these discussions in age-appropriate ways, learning to see death as a natural part of life, rather than a catastrophic failure. A father in Athens, writing to a friend about his mother's peaceful death, described how the family had gathered not in panic or denial, but in a spirit of gratitude for the life they had shared together. They told stories, shared memories, and spoke openly about their sadness, while also acknowledging the natural rhythm of generations. His children, rather than being traumatized by their grandmother's death, seemed to understand it as part of the larger pattern of existence, something that would eventually come to all of them, but need not be feared. This acceptance of mortality began influencing how people approach their daily lives as well. When you truly understand that your time is limited and precious, certain choices become obvious. Petty grudges seem pointless. Moments of beauty become more vivid. Relationships deepen because they're not taken for granted. Work becomes more meaningful when it's seen as a contribution to something larger than personal ambition. A carpenter in Corinth found that his Stoic practice had transformed not just how he thought about death, but how he experienced each day of life. He would begin each morning by quietly acknowledging that this might be his last day, not in a morbid way, but as a reminder to bring his full attention and care to whatever tasks and interactions lay ahead. This practice, he reported, had made him both a better craftsman and a more present father and husband. The influence on artistic expression during this period was particularly profound. Painters and sculptors began creating works that captured not just the beauty of life, but also its transience, finding in that temporary quality not sadness, but a kind of poignant sweetness. A mosaic artist in Rhodes became famous for works that seemed to embody the Stoic understanding of time and change, creating images that were beautiful precisely because they acknowledged the fleeting nature of all earthly forms. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to echo the rhythm of breath itself, the gentle rising and falling that marks our passage through life. These compositions had a quality that listeners found both stirring and soothing, as if the music itself were teaching them how to move gracefully through the cycles of joy and sorrow that characterize human existence. Poetry from this period reveals a remarkable shift in how people understood their place in the larger cosmos. Where earlier verse had often focused on human drama in isolation, these new works place personal experience within the context of natural cycles and universal patterns. Poets wrote about their loves and losses, their hopes and disappointments, but always with an awareness of how these individual experiences connected to something larger and more enduring. A poetess in Lesbos, whose work was preserved by admiring students, wrote verses that captured this cosmic perspective with particular grace. She could describe the pain of losing a child with heartbreaking honesty, while also finding in that loss a connection to all parents who had faced similar grief, and beyond that, to the natural world where death and birth were simply different movements in an eternal dance. Her poetry helped people find meaning in their suffering without diminishing its reality or significance. The educational practices that emerged during this time reflected this integration of personal wisdom with universal principles. Schools began teaching children not just facts and skills, but also how to think about thinking, how to observe their own mental and emotional processes with gentle curiosity rather than harsh judgment. Students learned to notice when they were trying to control things beyond their influence and to redirect their attention to areas where their efforts could make a genuine difference. A teacher in Ephesus developed exercises that helped his students practice these skills in low-stakes situations so they would be available during more challenging times. They might spend time observing their reactions to minor disappointments, like a favorite meal being unavailable or a planned activity being cancelled due to weather. Through these small experiments, they learned to distinguish between the immediate feeling of disappointment and the additional suffering that came from resistance or outrage about circumstances beyond anyone's control. These educational innovations began attracting attention from pedagogues throughout the ancient world. Delegations of teachers would travel to observe these methods' contexts. What and adapt them to their own culture they consistently found was that students taught these principles from an early age developed a kind of emotional intelligence and resilience that served them well in all areas of life. The influence on governance and public policy was equally significant. Officials who had been trained in Stoic principles brought a different quality to their decision-making processes. They learned to focus on the long-term welfare of their communities rather than short-term political advantage, to listen carefully to different perspectives before reaching conclusions, and to implement policies with steady persistence while remaining flexible about methods and details. A magistrate in Syracuse became renowned for his fair and thoughtful administration of justice. He had learned to separate his personal feelings about defendants from his evaluation of evidence and law. This didn't make him cold or mechanical, but rather more genuinely compassionate, because his decisions were based on principle rather than mood or bias. Citizens reported feeling that they received genuine hearings in his court, whether the ultimate decision was favorable to them or not. This approach to governance began influencing entire city-states. Communities that embraced these principles developed reputations for stability and fairness that attracted both settlers and trading partners. They were able to navigate political challenges with less divisiveness and social upheaval, not because they avoided difficult decisions, but because they made them from a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. The approach to economic life continued to evolve as well. Merchants and artisans who had embraced Stoic principles found themselves naturally developing what we might now call sustainable business practices. They understood that their own prosperity was connected to the health of their communities and the satisfaction of their customers. This led to approaches to commerce that balanced profit with social responsibility in ways that benefited everyone involved. A textile merchant in Kos developed innovative profit-sharing arrangements with the weavers who produced her goods. Instead of simply paying the lowest wages the market would bear, she created systems where everyone involved in the production process shared in the success of the enterprise. This wasn't just altruism, but practical wisdom, as she discovered that workers who felt valued and fairly compensated produced higher quality goods and remained loyal during challenging periods. These business innovations began spreading through trading networks as merchants discovered that partners who shared similar values were more reliable and trustworthy collaborators. Contracts became simpler and disputes less frequent when all parties approached their relationships from a foundation of mutual respect and long-term thinking. The influence on family life continued to deepen as well. Parents who had learned to distinguish between love and control found that their relationships with their children became more honest and more genuinely affectionate. They could provide guidance while respecting their children's autonomy, offer support while allowing age-appropriate challenges that would build character and capability. A mother in Pergamon wrote to her sister about how these principles had transformed her approach to raising her teenage daughter. Instead of the constant battles over behavior and choices that had characterized their earlier relationship, they now had conversations about values and decision-making. The girl was learning to think for herself while still benefiting from her mother's experience and wisdom. Their relationship had become more honest, more respectful, and paradoxically more close as the mother had learned to love her daughter as she was, rather than trying to shape her into a predetermined mold. Marriage relationships, where couples learned to apply, also evolving as they began to Stoic principles to their partnerships. Understand that they could only control their own contributions to the relationship, not their partner's responses or feelings. This led to a different kind of commitment, one based on personal virtue and choice, rather than neediness or possessiveness. A couple in Rhodes, married for over 2 decades, wrote jointly about how these insights had renewed their relationship during a particularly difficult period. Instead of each trying to change the other or blame external circumstances for their problems, they had focused on their own responses and choices. This shift in perspective had not only resolved their immediate conflicts, but had deepened their appreciation for each other and their commitment to growing together while respecting each other's individual paths. The approach to physical health and medicine was also evolving in fascinating ways. Physicians trained in Stoic principles developed more holistic approaches to healing that recognized the intimate connection between mental and physical well-being. They learned to help patients examine the beliefs and attitudes that might be contributing to their ailments, teaching techniques for managing stress and anxiety that often proved as effective as herbal remedies and other traditional treatments. A physician in Delphi began incorporating what we might now recognize as early forms of cognitive therapy into his medical practice. He helped patients identify the thought patterns that were creating unnecessary suffering and taught them practical methods for observing and redirecting their mental habits. Many patients reported not just physical improvement, but a general enhancement in their quality of life and relationships. This integrated approach to health began influencing medical education throughout the region. Students learned anatomy and pharmacology alongside lessons in psychology and ethics. They developed bedside manners that combined technical competence with genuine wisdom and compassion. Patients reported feeling not just physically treated, but emotionally supported and spiritually nourished by their encounters with these caregivers. The military applications of Stoic principles were proving equally valuable. Soldiers and officers who had been exposed to these teachings brought a different quality to their service. They could be fierce in battle while remaining humane in victory, disciplined in training while compassionate toward their comrades, loyal to their duties while maintaining their moral compass, even in morally complex situations. A veteran commander, reflecting on decades of military service, wrote extensively about how Stoic principles had helped him navigate the unique challenges of leadership in wartime. He had learned to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by their weight, to accept casualties without becoming callous to human suffering, to maintain hope during dark periods without losing touch with reality. His troops trusted him because they sensed that his courage came from wisdom rather than recklessness, his authority from character rather than mere rank. These military applications began influencing training programs throughout the ancient world. Soldiers learned not just tactics and weapons handling, but also mental discipline and emotional resilience. They practiced exercises in courage and endurance that prepared them for the psychological as well as physical demands of warfare. This created more effective fighting forces, but perhaps more importantly, it produced veterans who could reintegrate into civilian life with greater ease and sense of purpose. The religious and spiritual dimensions of this cultural transformation were particularly subtle but profound. While maintaining their traditional forms of worship and cultural observances, people began bringing a different quality of attention to their spiritual practices. They approached the gods not as cosmic vending machines, who might grant their wishes if properly appeased, but as expressions of the rational order that governed the universe. A priest at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi wrote about how pilgrims had changed during his decades of service, where once they had come primarily seeking predictions about the future or divine intervention in their personal affairs, they now seemed more interested in developing the wisdom to respond skillfully to whatever circumstances might arise. They were learning to consult the oracle not to gain control over their destinies, but to find peace with uncertainty itself. This shift in spiritual understanding began influencing religious practices throughout the region. Festivals and ceremonies maintained their traditional forms, but increasingly emphasized themes of gratitude, acceptance, and the interconnectedness of all life. Participants found in these celebrations not just communal joy, but also deeper meaning, a sense of their place in the larger patterns of existence. The artistic and literary expressions that emerged from this period reflect the quiet transformation that was occurring throughout society. Dramatists began writing plays that explored moral dilemmas with unusual nuance and depth. Their characters faced the same tragic circumstances that had always been the stuff of theatre, but they responded with a kind of heroic acceptance that was both deeply human and profoundly inspiring. A playwright in Athens, whose works were performed throughout the Greek world, became famous for dramas that left audiences feeling not just entertained, but somehow strengthened, more prepared to face their own challenges with dignity and grace. His characters demonstrated that true heroism lay not in avoiding suffering, but in meeting it with wisdom and virtue, not in controlling outcomes, but in controlling one's response to whatever outcomes emerged. Musicians and composers were creating works that seemed to embody the serenity that came from understanding the relationship between effort and acceptance. Their melodies had a quality that listeners found both stirring and peaceful, as if the music itself were teaching them how to move gracefully through the inevitable changes and challenges of life. Architects began designing buildings that reflected both human dignity and natural harmony. Their structures seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it, creating spaces that felt both grand and humble, enduring and organic. These buildings served their practical functions while also somehow embodying the Stoic understanding of humanity's place within the larger patterns of nature. The cumulative effect of all these individual and cultural changes was beginning to create something like a new vision of human possibility. Communities that had embraced these principles were demonstrating that people could live together with less conflict and more mutual support, that individuals could face life's challenges with greater resilience and wisdom, that prosperity and virtue could coexist rather than being in constant tension. Travelers moving through the ancient world during this period consistently remarked on the quality of life in cities and regions where Stoic ideas had taken root. There was something in the atmosphere, they would write, a kind of quiet confidence and contentment that seemed to characterize the people they encountered. Conversations had a different quality, less anxious complaining, and more thoughtful reflection. Conflicts still arose, but they were handled with more maturity and less destructive emotion. This transformation was particularly visible in how communities responded to the natural disasters and social upheavals that were simply part of ancient life. Earthquakes, floods, crop failures, political instability. These challenges still occurred, but they were met with what we might call philosophical resilience. People had learned to distinguish between the pain that comes from circumstances and the suffering that comes from resistance to circumstances. When a severe drought struck several cities in Asia Minor, observers from other regions were amazed at how the affected communities organized their response. There was grief, certainly, and acknowledgement of the real hardships that people were facing. But there was no wasted energy on raging against fate or searching for scapegoats to blame for what was clearly a natural phenomenon beyond human control. Instead, there was a quiet determination to respond to the crisis with whatever wisdom, skill, and compassion they could muster. The economic implications of this cultural shift were becoming increasingly apparent. Trade relationships became more stable when they were based on mutual respect and long-term thinking, rather than short-term advantage. Contracts were more likely to be honored, disputes resolved more fairly, partnerships maintained through both prosperous and difficult periods. This created a kind of commercial trust that facilitated economic growth while maintaining ethical standards. Cities that had embraced these principles began attracting settlers and traders who valued the predictability and fairness they found there. This created positive feedback loops as communities that practiced virtue became more prosperous, which allowed them to be more generous and supportive of those in need, which further enhanced their reputations and attractiveness to others. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this transformation was how it was beginning to influence the next generation. Children who had grown up in households and communities shaped by Stoic principles were reaching adulthood with capabilities and perspectives that impressed their elders. They seemed naturally equipped with emotional resilience, ethical clarity, and practical wisdom that typically took years to develop through conscious effort and study. These young people were less prone to the dramatic mood swings and impulsive decisions that often characterized youth. They could handle criticism without being devastated, accept praise without becoming arrogant, face challenges without being overwhelmed by anxiety or excitement. Most remarkably, they seemed to understand intuitively the difference between what they could and couldn't control, applying this knowledge naturally to everything from academic studies to romantic relationships. A teacher in Miletus wrote extensively about a generation of students who exemplified this new maturity. When faced with particularly difficult examinations, instead of panicking or making excuses, they would focus on preparing as thoroughly as possible while accepting that the outcome would depend on factors beyond their preparation. They supported each other without competing destructively, asked questions without fear of appearing ignorant, and approached their studies with both seriousness and genuine enjoyment. This generational shift suggested that Stoicism was evolving from something that individuals had to consciously learn and practice into something more like a cultural wisdom that could be absorbed naturally through growing up in communities that embodied these principles. The conversations that had begun in the painted porch in Athens were becoming woven into the fabric of daily life across the Mediterranean world. The influence was spreading beyond the Greek-speaking world as well. Roman merchants and officials who encountered these ideas during their travels began carrying them back to Italy. Egyptian scholars visiting Alexandria brought Stoic insights into their own philosophical traditions. Celtic and Germanic tribes trading along the northern frontiers absorbed aspects of this practical wisdom and adapted them to their own cultural contexts. Each culture that encountered these teachings found ways to express them that honored both the universal principles and their own particular values and circumstances. The core insights about what we can and cannot control, about finding meaning through virtue rather than external circumstances, about responding to challenges with wisdom rather than mere reaction. These ideas seem to translate across cultural boundaries while taking on local flavors and applications. A Celtic chieftain, writing to a Roman friend about how Stoic principles had influenced his approach to leadership, described adapting the teachings to his people's warrior culture. His fighters were learning to be fierce in battle while remaining compassionate in peace, brave in the face of danger while wise about which fights were worth engaging. The result was a more disciplined and effective fighting force that also lived more harmoniously during peaceful periods. As these ideas continued to spread and evolve, they carried within them the promise of transformation that had attracted that first shipwrecked merchant to a simple bookshop in Athens centuries earlier. They offered not escape from the challenges of human existence, but better tools for engaging with those challenges. Not immunity from suffering, but greater resilience in the face of difficulty, not control over external circumstances, but mastery of one's own responses and choices. The quiet revolution that had begun in the painted porch was becoming something far larger than its original participants could have imagined. It was touching every aspect of human experience, from the most intimate relationships to the largest questions of governance and social organization. And yet, it maintained the gentle, practical character that had marked it from the beginning, never demanding dramatic conversions or sudden transformations, but inviting people to experiment with new ways of thinking and being, to test these ideas against their own experience and adopt what proved useful. This organic growth and adaptation ensured that Stoicism would continue to evolve and spread, taking root wherever people were ready to embrace a different understanding of happiness, success, and the good life. The seeds planted in those early conversations about letting go and finding peace had grown into something that was quietly but profoundly changing the ancient world, preparing the ground for even greater transformations that lay ahead, as these ideas would eventually reach the corridors of power in Rome and spread throughout the vast territories of the empire. But that larger story, the tale of how Stoicism would influence emperors and slaves, generals and merchants, philosophers and ordinary citizens across the known world, was still unfolding. For now, it was enough to marvel at how far these simple insights had already traveled, how many lives they had touched, how many communities they had strengthened, and how they continued to spread like dawn breaking slowly across a vast landscape, bringing light to places that had long been shadowed by unnecessary confusion, anxiety, and suffering. The sleepy origins of Stoicism had awakened something enduring in human consciousness, something that would prove resilient enough to survive the rise and fall of empires, adaptable enough to speak to people across centuries and cultures, and practical enough to offer genuine help with the eternal challenges of being human in an uncertain world. The transformation spreading across the ancient world wasn't limited to grand philosophical discussions or formal educational settings. In the quiet corners of daily life, in the spaces between the dramatic moments that history tends to remember, ordinary people were discovering extraordinary shifts in how they experienced the simple act of being alive. A baker in Ephesus found that her morning routine had become something approaching meditation. As she kneaded dough before dawn, she would reflect on the parallel between bread making and life itself. Flour, water, salt, and yeast each had their own nature, their own contribution to make. Her job wasn't to force them into something they couldn't become, but to understand their properties and work with them skillfully. Some loaves would rise perfectly, others might fall flat despite identical ingredients and care. The difference lay in countless variables beyond her complete control: the humidity, the temperature, even the particular strain of wild yeast floating through her kitchen that morning. This understanding had transformed not just her relationship with bread, but with her customers, her family, even her own moods and disappointments. When a batch failed, she could observe her initial frustration without being consumed by it, learn what lessons the failure might offer, and begin again with renewed attention rather than discouraged resignation. Her bakery became known not just for excellent bread, but for the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to emanate from her steady, unhurried presence. Similar transformations were occurring in workshops and fields, in homes and markets throughout the Mediterranean world. A fisherman in the Aegean learned to read the sea with the same philosophical attention that scholars brought to their texts. Weather patterns, fish behavior, the subtle signs that indicated where to cast his nets. These became not just practical skills, but opportunities for practicing the art of careful observation without attachment to specific outcomes. Some days the catch would be abundant, others disappointingly small, but he had learned to find satisfaction in the skill and attention he brought to his work, regardless of results. His fellow fishermen began seeking his company not just for his practical expertise, but for the calm confidence he brought to their shared endeavors. Storms that once would have left him anxious and irritable now became simply weather to be navigated with whatever skill and patience he possessed. The influence was particularly profound in how people approach the countless small disappointments and frustrations that fill ordinary days. A merchant's planned journey delayed by storms, a potter's favorite glazing technique producing unexpected results, a mother's carefully prepared meal rejected by a finicky child. These minor setbacks that once might have generated hours of irritation and complaint were increasingly met with a kind of philosophical shrug. This wasn't indifference or resignation, but rather a growing understanding that resistance to what had already occurred was simply wasted energy. That energy could be better invested in responding skillfully to the new circumstances that had emerged. The storms would pass, or they wouldn't, but raging about them served no practical purpose. The glaze had behaved as chemistry and fire had determined, offering information about future experiments. The child would eat when hungry, and forcing the issue would only create conflict where none was necessary. These shifts in perspective began influencing entire communities in subtle but significant ways. Public gatherings became more civil, as people learned to listen to opposing viewpoints without immediately becoming defensive or combative. Market negotiations became more honest, as buyers and sellers recognized that their reputations mattered more than any single transaction. Neighborhood disputes were resolved more quickly, as people learned to focus on practical solutions, rather than who was to blame for problems that had already occurred. A magistrate in a small coastal town wrote to his brother about the changes he had observed during his years of service. Legal proceedings had become less contentious, as citizens learned to separate their emotional reactions from the facts of their cases. People were more willing to accept unfavorable verdicts when they trusted that the process had been fair, even if the outcome wasn't what they had hoped for. Crime rates had decreased, not because of harsher punishments, but because more people had found constructive ways to channel their energies and address their genuine needs. The artistic expressions that emerged during this period reflect the quiet revolution in consciousness that was occurring throughout society. Sculptors began creating works that captured not just physical beauty, but something more elusive, a quality of presence and acceptance that viewers found deeply moving. These weren't idealized figures removed from the struggles of ordinary life, but representations of real people who had learned to inhabit their lives with grace and dignity. A sculptor in Rhodes became famous for portrait busts that seemed to reveal something essential about their subject's character. Patrons would commission these works not just as commemorations, but as reminders of their own highest possibilities. The sculptor had learned to see beyond surface appearances to the wisdom and strength that existed, sometimes hidden, in every person who sat for him. Musicians were composing pieces that seemed to embody the rhythms of natural acceptance. These weren't melancholy compositions about resignation or defeat, but music that somehow captured the peaceful strength that comes from understanding one's place in larger patterns of existence. Audiences would leave these performances feeling not entertained in the usual sense, but somehow centered, more prepared to meet their own challenges with composure and skill. The influence on family relationships continued to deepen as parents and children learned to see each other as fellow travelers on the path of learning rather than adversaries in struggles for control. A father in Pergamon wrote about watching his teenage son navigate the disappointment of not being selected for an athletic competition. Instead of either dismissing the boy's feelings or encouraging him to rage against the unfairness of the selection process, they had talked together about the difference between preparation and outcome, about finding satisfaction in effort regardless of external recognition. The conversation had deepened their relationship in ways that surprised both of them. The son had learned that his father respected his autonomy and judgment, while the father had discovered that his child was more capable of wisdom and resilience than he had previously recognized. Their household became more peaceful, not because conflicts never arose, but because they had developed better tools for addressing disagreements when they did occur. Marriage relationships were evolving as couples learned to apply these principles to their most intimate partnerships. A woman in Corinth wrote to her sister about how she and her husband had weathered a particularly difficult period in their relationship. Instead of each trying to change the other or blame external circumstances for their problems, they had focused on their own contributions to both the difficulties and the solutions. This shift in perspective had not only resolved their immediate conflicts, but had deepened their appreciation for each other's individual qualities and their commitment to growing together while respecting each other's autonomy. They had learned to love each other as they were, rather than as they might someday become, while still supporting each other's continued development and learning. The influence on how communities dealt with aging and the care of elderly members was particularly touching. Instead of seeing old age as simply a period of decline to be endured, families and neighborhoods began recognizing the unique wisdom that could come with having lived through many cycles of change and challenge. Elderly people who had embraced these philosophical principles became valued advisors and teachers. Their perspectives sought not just on practical matters, but on the deeper questions of how to live well. An elderly weaver in Miletus became something of a local philosopher, though she never would have used such a grand term for herself. Young people would seek her out, not just to learn her craft, but to hear her gentle observations about patience, attention, and the satisfaction that comes from work done with care, regardless of external appreciation. Her workshop became an informal gathering place where people of all ages would come to talk through their challenges and listen to her quiet wisdom. She had learned through decades of practice that the quality of attention she brought to her work was more important than the specific pattern she created. This insight had gradually extended to every aspect of her life. Relationships, daily tasks, even her own thoughts and emotions became opportunities for practicing the same careful, non-judgmental awareness that had made her such a skilled craftsperson. The approach to physical health and healing continued to evolve as physicians and patients alike recognized the intimate connection between mental and physical well-being. Healers trained in these philosophical principles developed more holistic approaches that addressed not just symptoms, but the whole person's relationship to their condition. A physician in Kos began incorporating gentle questioning into his consultations, helping patients examine the beliefs and attitudes that might be contributing to their ailments. He found that many physical complaints were connected to chronic worry, resentment, or resistance to circumstances that couldn't be changed. By teaching patients simple techniques for observing and redirecting their mental habits, he often achieved better results than could be accomplished through herbs and traditional remedies alone. This integrated approach to health began attracting patients from throughout the region. People would travel considerable distances not just to receive treatment, but to learn these techniques for themselves. The physician's practice became something like a school where people learned not just how to manage specific health problems, but how to live in ways that supported their overall well-being and resilience. The influence on education was perhaps most significant of all, as teachers throughout the ancient world began incorporating these insights into their instruction. Students were learning not just facts and skills, but how to think about learning itself, how to approach new challenges with curiosity rather than anxiety, how to persist through difficulties without being discouraged by temporary setbacks. A school in Ephesus became renowned for producing graduates who were not only well educated in traditional subjects, but also remarkably mature and capable of handling life's inevitable uncertainties. These young people could accept criticism without being crushed, acknowledge their mistakes without being overwhelmed by shame, and pursue their goals with dedication while remaining flexible about methods and outcomes. The educational innovations developed at this school began attracting attention from throughout the Mediterranean world. Delegations of teachers would visit to observe these methods and adapt them to their own cultural contexts. What they consistently found was that students taught these principles from an early age developed emotional intelligence and resilience that served them well in all areas of life. The transformation in how people approached work and professional life was equally profound. Craftspeople, merchants, farmers, and professionals of all kinds were discovering that they could invest completely in their endeavors while holding the results more lightly. This paradoxical combination of full engagement with non-attachment often led to better outcomes, as people could focus their energy on the process rather than being distracted by anxiety about results. A silversmith in Athens wrote about how this understanding had revolutionized his craft. Previously, his work had been dominated by worry about whether each piece would meet his customers' expectations, whether it would enhance his reputation, whether it would provide adequate income for his family. This constant anxiety had actually interfered with his craftsmanship, making his hands less steady and his attention less focused. When he learned to pour his complete attention into the work itself, while accepting that its reception was beyond his ultimate control, his artistry flourished in ways that surprised even him. Pieces seemed to flow from his hands with a naturalness and beauty that attracted customers from throughout the region. Paradoxically, by caring less about external success, he achieved more of it than he had when success was his primary focus. The influence on religious and spiritual life was subtle but profound. While maintaining their traditional forms of worship, people began bringing a different quality of attention to their spiritual practices. They approached the divine not as a cosmic force to be bargained with or appeased, but as an expression of the rational order that governed all existence, including their own lives. Prayers became less about requesting specific outcomes and more about seeking wisdom and strength to respond skillfully to whatever circumstances might arise. Temple visits became opportunities for reflection and self-examination, rather than attempts to influence divine favor. Religious festivals maintained their joy and community celebration, while also serving as reminders of humanity's place within larger patterns of existence. Temple in Dia, priestess at Aelphi, wrote about how pilgrims had changed during her years of service. They came seeking not predictions about the future, or divine intervention in their personal affairs, but guidance on how to live wisely within whatever circumstances they encountered. They wanted to learn not how to control their destinies, but how to find peace with uncertainty itself. This shift in spiritual understanding began influencing religious practices throughout the region. Ceremonies and rituals maintained their traditional forms but increasingly emphasized themes of gratitude, acceptance, and the interconnectedness of all life. Participants found in these observances not just communal joy but deeper meaning, a sense of their proper relationship to the larger forces that shaped existence. The cumulative effect of all these individual and cultural changes was creating something unprecedented in the ancient world. Communities that had embraced these principles were demonstrating that people could live together with significantly less conflict and more mutual support, that individuals could face life's challenges with greater equanimity and wisdom, that material prosperity and ethical behavior could reinforce rather than contradict each other. Travelers consistently remarked on the quality of life in regions where these ideas had taken root. There was something in the atmosphere, they would write home, a sense of groundedness and contentment that seemed to characterize daily interactions. Business was conducted more honestly, disputes were resolved more fairly, and people seemed generally more capable of enjoying good fortune without being attached to it, and enduring hardship without being crushed by it. The economic benefits of this cultural transformation were becoming increasingly apparent. Trade relationships became more stable and profitable when they were based on mutual respect and long-term thinking. Communities that practiced these principles became preferred partners for merchants throughout the Mediterranean, creating positive cycles of prosperity and ethical behavior. Cities began competing not just on the basis of their commercial advantages, but on their reputations for fairness and reliability. This created incentives for good governance and ethical business practices that extended far beyond any individual's personal philosophical commitments. The principles that had emerged from quiet conversations in a painted porch were becoming embedded in the economic and political structures of entire civilizations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how natural and undramatic it seemed to those experiencing it. Unlike revolutionary changes imposed from above or dramatic conversions that transform people overnight, this shift in consciousness felt more like a gradual awakening, a slow recognition of capacities and perspectives that had always been present, but simply needed the right conditions to flourish. People didn't feel that they had adopted a foreign philosophy or abandoned their cultural traditions. Instead, they felt that they had discovered tools for living more fully within their existing circumstances, whatever those might be. The teachings didn't demand that they become different people, but rather that they become more skillful versions of who they already were. This organic quality ensured that the transformation would continue to spread and evolve, taking root wherever people were ready to embrace a different understanding of what it meant to live well. The seeds planted in those early conversations were growing into something that could adapt to any culture, any circumstance, any individual's particular challenges and opportunities. The quiet revolution that had begun with a shipwrecked merchant's encounter with ancient wisdom was becoming woven into the fabric of civilization itself, changing not through force or persuasion, but through the simple power of practical effectiveness. People adopted these principles because they worked, because they made life more manageable and more meaningful, because they offered genuine help with the eternal human challenges of finding purpose, peace, and connection in an uncertain world. As the decades passed and these ideas continued their gentle spread throughout the ancient world, they carried within them the promise that had attracted that first seeker to a bookshop in Athens, the promise that wisdom and tranquility were not distant destinations requiring heroic journeys to reach, but present possibilities available to anyone willing to look honestly at their own experience and learn to work skillfully with what they found there. The sleepy origins of Stoicism had awakened something that would prove remarkably durable and adaptable. something that would survive the collapse of the civilizations that had nurtured its early growth and continue to offer its quiet guidance to seekers across the centuries. But that larger story of insights, how these would travel through time and across cultures, was still unfolding, written day by day in the choices and experiences of ordinary people, learning to let go of what they couldn't control and embrace what they could. The influence of these early Stoic communities began to create something that even their founders could never have fully anticipated. As the philosophy matured and spread, it started to attract attention from the most unlikely quarters, drawing in people who might never have considered themselves philosophers, but who found in these practical teachings something their souls had been quietly seeking. In the great trading centres along the Mediterranean coast, a new kind of merchant was emerging. These were individuals who had learned to conduct their business with what we might call philosophical integrity, understanding that their character mattered more than their profit margins, that their reputation was their most valuable asset, and that true success came not from accumulating wealth, but from using whatever prosperity they achieved in service of something larger than themselves. A spice trader from Alexandria wrote extensively about this transformation in his approach to commerce. Where once he had been consumed by anxiety about market fluctuations, competitor actions, and the countless variables that could affect his ventures, he had learned to focus his energy on what was genuinely within his control: the quality of his goods, the honesty of his dealings, the fairness of his prices, and the reliability of his service. Everything else, he had discovered, would unfold according to patterns too complex for any individual mind to fully understand or manipulate. This shift in perspective hadn't made him less successful in worldly terms. Quite the opposite. Customers began seeking him out, not just for his excellent spices, but for the peace of mind that came from dealing with someone they could trust completely. His word became his bond in a way that eliminated the need for complex contracts and legal protections. Other merchants began asking him for advice, not just on commercial matters, but on how to find the same kind of centered confidence that seemed to characterize his approach to business and life. The influence was spreading into the most intimate corners of human experience as well. Women throughout the ancient world, despite the social constraints of their time, were finding ways to apply these teachings to their particular circumstances and challenges. They discovered that the principles of focusing on what could be controlled while accepting what couldn't be changed were especially relevant to lives that were often shaped by forces beyond their immediate influence. A midwife in Rhodes became renowned not just for her skill in helping women through childbirth, but for the calm presence she brought to what could be one of life's most anxious and unpredictable experiences. She had learned to prepare thoroughly for every delivery while accepting that each birth would unfold according to its own natural rhythm. Her peaceful confidence helped laboring mothers relax into the process rather than fighting against it, often making the entire experience safer and more manageable for everyone involved. She began teaching other women in her community these same principles of engaged acceptance, showing them how to find dignity and purpose even within roles that society might consider secondary or subordinate. The conversations that took place in her home became informal gatherings where women could explore how to apply philosophical wisdom to the practical challenges of managing households, raising children, and maintaining relationships while preserving their own sense of individual worth and purpose. The influence on how communities approached collective challenges was equally profound. When natural disasters struck or political upheavals threatened social stability, cities that had been touched by these teachings responded with a kind of organized resilience that impressed observers from other regions. Instead of being paralyzed by the magnitude of their problems or consumed by fruitless attempts to assign blame, these communities focused their energy on practical responses that could actually make a difference. After a devastating fire swept through several districts of a major port city, visitors were amazed at the calm efficiency with which residents organized relief efforts. There was genuine grief for what had been lost and honest acknowledgement of the hardships that lay ahead. But there was no wasted energy on raging against circumstances that had already occurred. or searching for scapegoats to punish for what was clearly an accident of fate and wind direction. Instead, there was a quiet determination to rebuild in ways that might prevent similar disasters in the future, to care for those who had lost everything, and to find in this apparent catastrophe an opportunity to create something better than what had existed before. The reconstruction became a community effort that strengthened social bonds and created more beautiful, more functional neighborhoods than had existed previously. This practical resilience began attracting attention from political leaders throughout the Mediterranean world. Governors and administrators started seeking out teachers who could help them apply these principles to the complex challenges of governance. They were discovering that the same insights that helped individuals navigate personal difficulties could inform approaches to public policy and social organization. The question of how to balance individual freedom with social responsibility, for instance, found new clarity through this philosophical lens. Communities learned to encourage personal initiative and self-reliance while still providing support for those facing genuine hardships beyond their control. They developed systems that helped people through temporary difficulties without creating permanent dependence. Recognizing that true compassion sometimes meant allowing individuals to face challenges that would ultimately strengthen their character and capabilities. An administrator in a prosperous trading city developed innovative approaches to public works that honored both practical needs and human dignity. Instead of simply hiring laborers to build roads and harbors, he created educational programs that taught valuable skills while accomplishing necessary infrastructure improvements. Workers learned engineering, project management, and specialized crafts while contributing to their community's development. This approach created not just better infrastructure, but more capable and confident citizens. The influence on artistic expression during this period was particularly beautiful. Creators of all kinds were discovering that the same principles that brought peace to daily life could liberate and enhance their creative work. Painters, sculptors, musicians, and poets began approaching their art with a different quality of attention, focusing completely on the creative process, while remaining unattached to how their work might be received by others. A painter in Athens wrote about how this understanding had transformed her relationship with her art. Previously, her work had been dominated by anxiety about whether each painting would enhance her reputation, attract wealthy patrons, or meet the expectations of critics and fellow artists. This constant worry had actually interfered with her creativity, making her second-guess her instincts and producing work that felt forced and inauthentic. When she learned to pour her complete attention into the painting itself, while accepting that its reception was beyond her ultimate control, her artistry began to flow with a naturalness and power that surprised even her. Colors seemed to choose themselves. Compositions emerged organically from her materials, and each piece became an exploration rather than a predetermined outcome. The work that emerged from this new approach was not only more personally satisfying, but also more compelling to viewers, who could sense the authentic presence and freedom that had gone into its creation. Musicians were discovering similar liberation in applying these principles to their performances. A lyre player in Delphi found that when she stopped trying to control her audience's reactions and focused entirely on serving the music itself, her playing became more expressive and emotionally resonant. She could take risks, explore subtle variations, and respond spontaneously to the acoustic qualities of different performance spaces. Because she was no longer afraid of making mistakes or failing to meet expectations, her performances began attracting audiences from throughout the region, not because she had developed superior technical skills, but because people could feel the authenticity and presence she brought to her music. Listeners would leave her concerts feeling not just entertained, but somehow nourished, as if they had been reminded of something beautiful and true about existence itself. The educational innovations that emerged during this period were equally remarkable. Teachers throughout the ancient world began incorporating these philosophical insights into their instruction, helping students develop not just intellectual knowledge, but emotional wisdom and practical life skills. Children were learning to approach their studies with curiosity rather than anxiety, to persist through difficulties without being discouraged by temporary setbacks, and to find satisfaction in learning itself rather than only in external recognition or rewards. A school in Pergamon became famous for producing graduates who were not only well educated in traditional subjects, but also remarkably mature and capable of handling life's inevitable uncertainties. These young people could accept constructive criticism without being devastated by it, acknowledge their limitations without being paralyzed by self-doubt, and pursue their goals with dedication while remaining flexible about methods and outcomes. The teaching methods developed at this school began attracting educators from throughout the Mediterranean world. What they consistently discovered was that students who learned these principles alongside their regular academic subjects developed a kind of resilience and wisdom that served them well in every area of life. They were better able to form healthy relationships, make sound decisions, and contribute positively to their communities, regardless of whatever specific careers they eventually pursued. The influence on family dynamics continued to deepen as parents and children learned to see their relationships as opportunities for mutual growth and learning, rather than battles for control or conformity. Households that embraced these principles became more peaceful, not because conflicts never arose, but because family members had developed better tools for addressing disagreements when they did occur. A father in Ephesus wrote about how these teachings had transformed his relationship with his adult children. Instead of trying to direct their life choices or feeling responsible for their successes and failures, he had learned to offer his love and wisdom while respecting their autonomy and individual paths. This shift had actually brought them closer together, as his children felt free to seek his advice without fearing judgment or unwanted interference in their decisions. Marriage relationships were evolving in equally profound ways. Couples were learning to see their partnerships as alliances between two independent individuals who chose to share their lives while maintaining their personal integrity and individual growth. This created a different kind of intimacy, one based on mutual respect and genuine choice rather than neediness or possessive attachment. A couple in Corinth, married for over 3 decades, wrote jointly about how these principles had renewed their relationship during what could have been a difficult period of adjustment as their children left home and they faced their own aging. Instead of clinging to past roles or trying to prevent inevitable changes, they had learned to appreciate each stage of their shared journey while remaining open to whatever new forms their love might take as circumstances evolved. The approach to physical health and medical treatment was also evolving in fascinating directions. Physicians trained in these philosophical principles were developing more integrated approaches to healing that recognized the intimate connection between mental attitudes and physical well-being. They learned to help patients examine not just their symptoms, but their entire relationship to health, illness, and the natural processes of embodied existence. A physician in Kos began incorporating gentle philosophical inquiry into his medical consultations, helping patients understand how their beliefs and emotional patterns might be contributing to their physical ailments. He found that many chronic conditions improved significantly when people learned to reduce the mental suffering they were adding to their physical discomfort through worry, resistance, and catastrophic thinking about their symptoms. This approach didn't minimize the reality of physical illness or suggest that people could simply think their way to perfect health. Rather, it helped them distinguish between the unavoidable discomfort that might come with certain conditions and the additional suffering they were creating through their mental reactions to those conditions. By learning to accept what couldn't be changed while working skillfully with what could be influenced, patients often found that their overall quality of life improved dramatically, even when their underlying medical issues remained challenging. The military applications of these principles were proving equally valuable. Soldiers and officers who had been exposed to these teachings brought a different quality to their service that made them more effective in combat, while helping them maintain their humanity and moral compass, even in the most challenging circumstances. A veteran commander wrote extensively about how these philosophical insights had shaped his approach to military leadership over decades of service. He had learned to make difficult strategic decisions without being paralyzed by their weight, to accept casualties without becoming callous to the human cost of warfare, and to maintain hope and purpose even during the darkest periods of prolonged campaigns. His troops trusted him because they sensed that his courage came from wisdom rather than recklessness, that his authority was rooted in character rather than mere rank, and that he genuinely cared about their welfare while understanding the realities of their shared profession. Units under his command became known not just for their effectiveness in battle, but for their discipline during peaceful periods and their ability to maintain morale through extended hardships. The religious and spiritual dimensions of this cultural transformation were perhaps the most subtle, but also the most profound. While people maintained their traditional forms of worship and cultural observances, they began approaching their spiritual lives with a different quality of understanding and attention. And so we find ourselves at the end of this gentle journey through time, having traced the quiet footsteps of a philosophy born not in grand halls of learning, but in the everyday conversations of ordinary people seeking extraordinary peace. From that painted porch in ancient Athens, where a shipwrecked merchant first discovered that wisdom wasn't about controlling the storms of life, but learning to dance with them, we've watched these simple yet profound insights ripple outward like circles on still water, touching every corner of human experience. The sleepy origins of Stoicism remind us that the most powerful transformations often begin not with dramatic proclamations, but with quiet questions, not with rigid rules, but with gentle invitations to see our challenges differently, in learning to let go of what was never truly ours to control. Those early students discovered something far more valuable than any treasure that could be lost in a shipwreck. They found a kind of freedom that no storm could sink, no tyrant could confiscate, no misfortune could diminish. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll carry with you this ancient gift, this gentle art of releasing your grip on the uncontrollable while embracing fully what remains within your power to shape. In your thoughts, your choices, your responses to whatever tomorrow might bring, you hold the same quiet strength that sustained those first seekers in the painted porch, the same peaceful wisdom that has whispered its way through centuries, still offering its patient guidance to anyone ready to listen. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler, and may you find in letting go not emptiness, but the space for something beautiful to grow.